Hello everyone, my name is Don K. Preston. I am the president of Preterist Research Institute. Welcome to Preston's Ponderings. Well, it's time to answer another objection or two. One of the most common objections against preterism is that, boy, look, preterists are denying a future coming of the Lord. Preterists must be the scoffers of 2 Peter chapter 3. Therefore, the presence of the preterist movement is, in fact, a sign that we're in the last days. After all, Peter said, in the last days scoffers shall come, saying, where's the promise of his coming? See, that's the preterist. No, it's not. Let's notice several facts very quickly about 2 Peter chapter 3 and the question of the scoffers. Now, I've written a book, The Elements Shall Melt with Fervent Heat, in which I discuss the identity of the scoffers in depth. And matter of fact, it is, to my knowledge, one of the most in-depth examinations and studies of the question of the scoffers in 2 Peter chapter 3 that's to be found anywhere. Let me recommend that you get a copy of that book, The Elements Shall Melt with Fervent Heat, and examine this issue. But let me notice just a few things very quickly in this particular segment. First of all, take note of the fact that what Peter says in 2 Peter chapter 3, he tells us, is just a reiteration of what he wrote in the first epistle. Peter says, this second epistle I now write unto you, in both of which to stir up your holy minds by way of remembrance of that which was spoken by the holy prophets and by Jesus and his apostles. So, 2 Peter 3 is a reiteration of 2 Peter chapter 1. Now, what did Peter say about the day of the Lord in 1 Peter, his first epistle? Well, number one, he said Christ was ready, from the Greek word hitoimos, which means not only morally prepared, but temporally ready. He is ready to judge, or ready to be revealed. 1 Peter chapter 1, verse 5. 1 Peter chapter 1 and verse 10, he said concerning the revelation of Jesus Christ and the salvation to come at his parousia, he said concerning that salvation, the Old Testament prophets were informed that it was not for their day, but he said for us. 1 Peter chapter 1, verse 10. Notice the temporal contrast. They knew it was not for their day, it was for Peter's day. Furthermore, he said in 1 Peter chapter 4 and verse 5 that Christ was ready, Greek word hitoimos, to judge the living and the dead. He said in verse 7, the end of all things has drawn near. He said in verse 17, the time, literally the appointed time, for the judgment has come. Okay, what's the point? Well, whatever the day of the Lord is in 2 Peter chapter 3, Peter said his doctrine of that day of the Lord in 2 Peter 3 was a reiteration of what he said in 1 Peter. But in 1 Peter, he said the day of the Lord was at hand. Therefore, we cannot make him say in 2 Peter chapter 3, it's not at hand. That would contradict himself. Point number two, the fact that Peter says that what he is writing about is from the Old Testament prophets means that we would find the scoffers in the Old Testament. And in Isaiah chapter 28, guess what? The Lord said that in the day in which he laid the foundation stone for the Messianic temple, scoffers would come. When would that happen? Again, in the day that he laid the foundation of the Messianic temple. And that foundation is none other than Jesus himself. So, in the day in which the foundation stone for the Messianic temple would be laid, i.e. Jesus Christ, the scoffers would come. But the Messianic temple, the foundation for it, was laid in the first century. And guess what? There were scoffers in the first century denying the work of Jesus, because Paul went into the synagogue of Antioch of Pisidia, and there he preached the gospel. And he says, beware you scoffers and you despisers, beware that lest that come upon you, which is spoken of by the prophets. And he quotes Habakkuk chapter 1. Paul was dealing with the scoffers who were denying the work of Jesus. They were denying that he was the foundation stone of the Messianic temple. Oh, that That means the scoffers were the Old Covenant Jews denying the work of Jesus and denying his coming in judgment of that Old Covenant world. Thirdly, Peter is more than emphatic that he and his first century contemporaries were living in the last days of which he speaks. He says, in the last days, scoffers shall come. Now, some want to say, oh, he's talking about far off future time. Oh, he's talking about our day when the preterists are denying the coming of the Lord. More on that in a moment. No, Peter is emphatic. In Acts chapter 3, he says, Moses, Samuel, and all of the prophets, who have ever spoken, have spoken of, quote, these days, unquote. That was the first century days. Furthermore, the writer of Hebrews says Christ appeared. When? In the last days. The last days existed in the first century. And remember what Peter said in 1 Peter chapter 1? Christ was manifested in the last time. 1 Peter chapter 1, verse 20. So scoffers would come in the last days. Peter said they were living in the last days. You see, Peter's writing about contemporary issues. When he says that scoffers will come in the last days, remember, he is reminding them of what the Old Testament prophets said would happen in the last days. He said that the Old Testament prophets spoke of the days in which he was living. He says the Old Testament prophets knew it was not supposed to happen in their day, but in his day. Finally, what about this issue? What about the claim that preterists are a sign that we're in the last days? Preterists are the scoffers. Oh, no. Watch this. The scoffers of 2 Peter chapter 3 would say, where's the promise of his coming? What do the preterists do? They point to his coming in AD 70 and say, fulfilled. Unlike the scoffers, who would deny the occurrence of the parousia, the second coming, preterists, more than anyone else, and I say that as kindly as possible, preterists, more than anyone else, affirm the reality of the second coming, and they point to it in AD 70, because Jesus said his coming was to be in the lifetime of the first century audience. Remember what he said in Matthew 16, 27, 28? The Son of Man will come in the glory of the Father with his angels, and shall reward every man according to his works. Verily I say unto you, there are some standing here which shall not taste of death until they see the Son of Man coming in his kingdom. Preterists are the only ones who honor that text and say, there, in the lifetime of the first century audience, there was the second coming of Christ, just like he said. Oh, no, folks. Preterists are not a sign that we're in the last days, because preterists do not deny the coming of the Lord. They affirm it. They affirm that it occurred as it was predicted when it was predicted. Therefore, the objection lodged against preterism, that preterists are the fulfillment of 2 Peter 3 and the scoffers who would come in the last days, is false from the beginning of the claim to the last of the claim. The last days were in the first century. The scoffers were present in the first century. Preterists do not deny the coming of the Lord. They affirm it and say, there it was, just like Jesus said. We'll have more. Thanks for joining us for Preston's Ponderings. We'll see you on the flip side.